This book is a really, really good read. The Me You Love in the Dark is a 5-issue miniseries published by Image Comics in 2021 and a subsequent trade which was published in 2022, with story by Scotty Young, art by Jorge Corona, and colors by Jean-Francois Beaulieu. I was able to pick the trade up from Amazon for about $15, and I have read this cover to cover like 3 times already. This is a very engaging story. At the surface, it's a horror story, but when you look at it as an analogy, is that this is also a story about a very controlling relationship, abusive relationship. I was so enthralled and really into the story so much that I actually went ahead and I picked up issue number 1, Virgin variant, with cover art by John Lamb. It's an amazing looking book. I keep it in my light 2s with fullbacks, but it's a great looking cover. Definitely a 9/8, but this is it's a great book for my collection. The story starts off with a young up-and-coming artist by the name of Rowena, or Row as she likes to be called, who is actually coming off of a very successful showing at a gallery. It was so successful, in fact, that the gallery owner is commissioning her to do some more work so they can have another showing. So Row decides to rent this old-style Victorian home that looks like it may have been built in the 1800s. Beautiful-looking house, except the real estate agent informs her that the word is that this house is haunted, and Row really doesn't seem to have a problem with that. Forward a couple of weeks, and Row is still unpacking, playing music, drinking wine. She really hasn't begun to hunker down to do any artwork yet. And during the course of this, you can see the spirit. It's this white line, this white mist that we as the reader can see, knowing that this entity is there, watching her, trying to figure out who is she, what is she doing there. And she decides to start hunkering down and start doing some artwork. She decides to go into this dark room to focus. And darkness plays a big part in this story. So by her going into this darkened area, this will eventually empower this entity. But that comes to play later on in the story. So one day as she's working, she gets frustrated. She has complete creator's block. And she destroys what she's already working on. And why am I making this horrible art? And jokingly, she asks the entity, well, should I just give up and become a barista? It's then when the entity says something that completely scares Row.
No, you should not.
And with that, she runs out. She runs out of the house. She's freaked out. And she gets her senses back. She comes back into the house. And written on her easel is simply the words, "I'm sorry." In other words, the entity is sorry that he frightened her. Sorry he scared her. Now, Row is now intrigued about finding out about this entity. So she begins asking questions. One question was, "Are you a ghost?" And the entity replies, "I am something different." And the look on Row's face clearly shows that she is now terrified. She now does not know how to respond to that. And she asks, "Are you real?" And the entity simply says,
I am very real.
So Row now knows that she is being watched by this entity. Now, the entity is actually rather intrigued by her artwork, and he believes that this is the key to her happiness. So one day he asks if he may enter. Throughout the story, he starts off being very kind and benevolent and becomes controlling, which you'll see later in the video. But he enters, and you see the painting that Rowe did of what she believes this entity looks like. Now, come around Christmas time, they're watching Christmas movies and they're enjoying it. And then the entity says, I have a surprise for you. And he walks her down the hall and he lights up the staircase. Wall is completely covered in art because the entity believes that art is the key to Rowe's happiness. They begin to form a friendship, and the friendship becomes a little more until eventually it becomes full shape of water. Now, she's been cooped up in the house. The weather's been horrible. She hasn't been able to go out. So she decides she's going to go into town and pick up some art supplies. And the entity, he's not having it. He doesn't want her to leave. And this is when the controlling aspect of what this entity is begins to start to take effect. He doesn't want her to leave the house. And then all of a sudden, he creates this huge meal for her to keep her in the house. So as time is going on, they are kind of becoming closer. But being cooped up in the house is beginning to have its toll on Rowe. She wants to go out and smell fresh air and have the sunlight on her. And she finally breaks down and says, look, I'm not here for you. I'm here for me. And the demon begins to start showing his true colors.
Do not raise your voice in my house.
Now, one of the more important parts of this book is where Rowe decides she wants to just go ahead and really exert her independence. And this happens when one day she wants some sunlight. Just something simple as sunlight to help her work. And the entity keeps telling her he wants the curtains closed. And in an open act of defiance, she simply tears the curtains down. And the entity, beginning to show that he is not kind and benevolent, simply tells her, you are going to regret that. Addison shows up and wants to know how she's doing, wants to know, how much have you created? How much do we have to put in the gallery? And he walks in, and the entity does not appreciate Addison being there. The entity is jealous. The entity wants him to leave and tells Rowe, get rid of him or I will. Rowe is now at the point that she is now terrified to be in this house. She hasn't been able to leave. Addison starts looking through the art she's created, and she has created enough art for 10 showings. She has been extremely just engrossed in what she's been doing. But apparently it is not exactly what Addison was expecting. Rowe finally says, look, I can't leave this house. He's keeping me here. He won't let me leave. Who? Who is it? Who's keeping you here? Is there somebody else in the house? And in one panel, you see the true fear in Rowe's face when she simply points and says, him. And behind Addison, you can see the entity coming in. The entity kills Addison. Rowe is absolutely stunned and shocked by this. The entity decides to use Addison's corpse as a meat puppet, thinking this was bringing Addison back to life. She is extremely mad. She is in fear of her life. And since the entity believes that her key to happiness is her art, he kind of forces her back into her working space to create some art. As she is going into her workspace, she looks and sees paint thinner, which is a petroleum-based product, and she begins hatching a plan. Now, some time goes, and the entity arrives saying, may I see what you've worked on? Or what she paints is this dark black nebula, lifeless void. That is how she now sees the entity. She then takes her paint thinner, is able to ignite it, and throws it at the entity. The house is beginning to go up in flames. And you see this one beautiful panel, colorful panel of the house is in flames. The entity's looking down on her. And she finally is able to run out of the house. And in the last 4 panels of Rose's story is that the house is burning down. She walks to the edge, apparently to the sidewalk. She sits down and she looks up with a smile on her face, knowing that she's finally escaped what she's been going through. Now, fast forward some time, and there's this old antique shop. People are looking at this work, trying to find some art for their house, whatever the case may be. And they come across the very first painting that Rose did of what she perceived the entity to look like. And it has fire marks on it, scorch marks from the house fire. And they actually decide to go ahead and purchase the piece of work. This is a very engaging story. I would highly recommend you pick it up, particularly the trade, because it just seems to flow a little better reading it all in one sitting. I would probably like to see this get a big screen adaptation, preferably probably 3D animation, so the artists can actually render the art in the book accurately, because the art in the book is absolutely amazing. But I would highly recommend you pick this up. It's just a phenomenal book, and it really helps break down the mundane, typical superhero stuff. This is a definite solid read. So pick it up. I highly recommend it.